Oh, sorry, that was the wrong clip. Hello everyone, welcome to another ranking video. This time we'll be talking about Pink Floyd. Well, considering that they're so universally popular and how they don't really need any introduction, I'm instead going to tell you why I chose this band. Number 1. Roger Waters is going to be releasing a re-recording of Dark Side of the Moon next month. It's gonna be so great, you guys. So yeah, there's that. But reason number 2, I wanted to revisit this band for a while. I've heard all of their albums before, even listened to some of them several times, but there's been some that I wanted to refresh on since it's been a long time since I first heard them. So yeah, I re-listened to their whole discography, and there were indeed several albums where I pretty much feel different about them now. There's also some that I still like and some that I still dislike. Pink Floyd has a very interesting history when it comes to band members and what they did on every album that tends to differ from the rest. So I thought that it would be a good band to do a ranking video on. I'm covering all of the 15 studio albums, yes, even the 2 soundtrack ones, because they are labeled as studio albums and everyone tend to label them as such, so yeah, let's start with the worst one. So, A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Yeah, this is one of the albums that I still particularly dislike. So to give a little bit of context, this was the first album after the departure of Roger Waters, and it clearly shows. As much of a control freak Roger Waters was becoming with each album since the mid-70s, he was still an essential part of the band. So yeah, when he left, it seems like the band simply didn't know what to do, and this album definitely shows a lot of signs of it. Going in, I was expecting the dated 80s production to be the biggest problem with the album, but to my surprise it actually wasn't. In fact, far from it. Even if it still hinders the album. A Momentary Lapse of Reason's biggest downfall is simply that the album is very uninspired. The first 2 tracks are kind of fine, I actually kind of like Learning to Fly. I get the appeal of it even if it's kind of shallow and bland, but you can still feel the band's lack of excitement on the record from the very start regardless. Towards the middle of the album it seems to get progressively more boring and forgettable, and by the second half it just becomes utterly worthless. The second half is riddled with songs that feel like they were just only added to pad out the album to 51 minutes because, well, they basically serve no purpose. Like, even when it comes to the songs themselves, they're just not worth listening to in any way. Some of these songs, I don't even know if you can hardly even call them songs, and the band's energy at that point is also at an all-time low. The closing track is definitely the best example of this, because it probably is a song where the band just cares the less. Like, there's really just no energy or no care doing this song at all. Also, there's Dogs of War, which is the worst song of the album. In fact, it's the worst song that Pink Floyd has ever done. Like, I legitimately don't know what the band was thinking with this one. This song is genuinely terrible. So, while not entirely an awful album, and it does have its few okay moments that can be considered pretty, even if it's mostly from the start, this album still feels like the band's least genuine effort, an album that was probably just made to continue seem relevant, and really less so for passion. It's not good.
And far from flying high in clear blue skies.
The Final Cut. This album sucks. Well, re-listening to the discography, I was hoping that the Final Cut was going to be better than I remember, like an actually okay record that just happens to be kind of forgettable. But no, this album is pretty bad. A lot of people have pointed out that this album is the opposite problem of A Momentary Lapse of Reason, where it has too much Roger Waters on it, and they're probably right. It's simply because Pink Floyd is one of those bands that just simply cannot be carried over by 1 or 2 people. This is probably going to further prove my point. They're a band that just simply work better together. The Final Cut was pretty much when Roger Waters took too much control, to the point where the record can be considered, well, a Roger Waters solo project in spirit. The album tackles a lot more political and depressive themes, even more so than The Wall, the album before it. And unfortunately, Roger Waters' vocal performance in so many of these tracks become quickly tiring and even occasionally annoying to hear. Especially since there doesn't really seem to be much variety when it comes to the themes that it tackles, and especially with the sound of the album as well. This album just feels so much more banal and homogeneous than The Wall, and I'm comparing both because apparently half of the album was unused tracks from that album, in which I find it hard to believe because The Wall is a much better album. Like, there's not even any competition between the two. I will say, I do like the album cover. I mean, the same can be said for A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Why are they wasting good album covers for bad projects? I don't know. The 80s really were the band's lowest point. The Endless River. I don't really have much to say about this one, honestly. This is, according to Gilmour, the last Pink Floyd album that will ever be released, and I mean, nice to see that the band isn't going to try to remain relevant past their golden age anymore, but this album still feels like the least essential Pink Floyd album to date. So the album is mainly instrumental and ambient music that was composed during the sessions of The Division Bell. The Division Bell was released 20 years before this album, by the way. And as far as the music goes, it's pretty forgettable. It's not as actively bad as the two albums that I talked about, and there's really nothing here that I find particularly offensive or unlistenable, but the album overall still feels kind of wordless because you really don't get much out of it. It's pretty much an album that goes in one ear and out the other. Really, at best, can be enjoyed as just background music, which is probably not the best thing you'll want to say about a Pink Floyd album, trust me. Well, let's go back to one of the older albums now. Obscured by Clouds is a soundtrack album for a French movie. And if I were to talk about it as an album, again, I'm ranking this based on album criteria. I will say Obscured by Clouds is pretty unremarkable. It's not a terrible album, there's a lot of it you could say it's fine to an extent, but I honestly still find it to be pretty boring. By 1972, Obscured by Clouds just feels like the least inventive release of the band so far by that point, where it really is just trading ground from older records but done with less impact. A lot of the songs feel kind of the same, and the band just feels like it's on autopilot, like it feels very standard. The first song is good at the very least. More. The other soundtrack album for the movie of the same name. I actually like this one slightly more than Obscured by Clouds, even if it's still not very good. It kinda has the same problems as Obscured by Clouds, where the album as a whole is kind of boring and unremarkable, and I will even say some of these songs don't even really feel like songs. I mean, I don't know, they were probably just better for the movie, but I think the album does have some interesting ideas here and there that puts it a little bit above, the other album that I talked about. And some of it is eerie in a way that is at the very least a little bit captivating. There's even two songs here that I like in contrary to just one in Obscured by Clouds. I'll still probably never listen to it again though. Almagama. Back when I was exploring this band's discography for the first time 3 years ago or so, I remember Almagama being one of the few that I was actually very negative to. And unlike albums like The Final Cut and Momentary Lapse of Reason where I found myself still not very fond of, Almagama was definitely better than I remember. It's not great, but it does have a few good things about it. One of the weirdest things about the record is that it's a double album that it's divided into two parts. The first disc is live songs and the second disc is studio songs. As many people pointed out, the live chunk of the album is one of the good things about it. And while I don't think it's one of the best live albums of all time, what they do here is undeniably good. Not only keeping a lot of the qualities from their original studio versions, but also doing something different with them. Then you get to the studio songs, which I think are kind of hit or miss. The studio part in Almagama is pretty much an album that is devoted into giving each member of the band their own section. As for the sections that I do like, I actually like Sisyphus, mainly because of the cinematic and somewhat classical tone of it. There are parts that I think are pretty interesting in how haunting they are, even if they can be hard to stomach at first. Part 4 especially has a jump scare in the middle of the song which I like as well. Narrow Way is also another section that I like. It goes through a lot of psychedelic passages and the song gets better as it goes. But then you have the two sections which is where I think the album flounders. The Roger Waters stuff is weird to say the least. Grantchester Meadows is a pretty but dull song and several species of small furry animals gathered together in a cave and grew with a pig. Oh, what a long title. Yeah, that song kind of speaks for itself. It's the most avant-garde direction the album heads to, and unfortunately, as odd as it is, it doesn't really work neither on its own or as a piece of the album. And then you have the last section, which is definitely my least favorite. It's really boring. It barely even feels like music, and by the end, it doesn't really achieve anything. So yeah, as a whole, it's a rocky album where half the time it feels like the band was just fucking around and there's really just not much cohesion as a whole. But it's far from terrible in my opinion. For the few good things that it has, I think the album is overall alright. This one is actually also okay. Division Bell, the second album to be released by the band after the departure of Roger Waters, and as far as this one goes, it is a noticeable improvement over A Momentary Lapse of Reason, even if it's still not great. The main reason for that is that the Division Bell definitely feels like a much more inspired project, even a more memorable one. The band still occasionally feels like they're on autopilot here, and far from reaching that impact that they were able to find on a lot of their 70s albums. Well, except for that one song that I'll be talking about later. I also don't like when they bring in backup singers in some songs like Wearing the Inside Out or Keep Talking. It just doesn't really fit well with the songs. Keep Talking especially, that's probably my least favorite song of the album. That said, there are some themes and ideas here that are definitely defined and are interesting to an extent. And I like how the band also covers some history with Paul Support, a song that talks about the former leadership of Syd Barrett and Roger Waters from Gilmour's point of view. And then you have High Hopes, which is actually pretty great. I wouldn't say it's a top 10 song for the band, but it's still the best song that they've released since Anything on the Wall. I love the symphonic rock and progressive rock approach that it takes, that it manages to make the song feel grand. Also, the guitar solo in the second half is pretty awesome. So yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is the Division Bell actually feels like the band was trying here, and the results were at the very least admirable for the most part. Okay, this is the point where we start to get to the really good albums. Saucerful of Secrets is the second album that they've ever released, and the follow-up to their debut. This was the one that I remember being indifferent towards back in the day, but I definitely like it a lot more now. So what's good about it? Well, let's start with the two songs that I like the most from the album, those being Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun and the title track. Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun is a very immersive in how low-key, mysterious and even minimalistic it feels. It feels very hypnotic as well. And the title track is one of the few times in their earlier years where their experimentation is able to shine through. It's a surreal and adventurous song, dense and utterly insane. A favorite of mine for sure. And the rest of the album is also mostly good, although a little inconsistent. Some of the songs do feel a little out of place, like Corporal Clegg, which I don't like as much as the other tracks. Otherwise, the album is at the very least mostly really good. One last thing that I'll mention is that the album in retrospective is kind of ahead of its time. There really weren't many albums from the 60s that sounded like this, so it makes the album more impressive in that regard. Pink Floyd with Syd Barrett in leadership was truly an interesting time to say the least. If he never left the band, they could have possibly gone to make some of the weirdest albums of the 70s. I'm saying this because Paper is a pretty weird album. It's their debut and the most psychedelic rock album that they've ever made, even more so than the following albums. It's definitely an interesting album for sure. It has a lot of joyful instrumentation, but most of the time in a rather uncanny and haunted sort of way, especially when it comes to the last song. Yeah, Biker is probably the most divisive Pink Floyd song for a reason. It also switches back and forth between long, progressive-ish rock songs that are kind of demented, and happier sounding but creepy sounding songs. It's a good contrast. A lot of people tend to like the first song of the album the most, and while that one is great and a very trippy start for the band, my favorite song has always been Interstellar Overdrive, which is one of the most trippy and surreal songs from the album for sure. It's an album that aims for a lot of weirder, more experimental approaches, and it ends up succeeding in nearly all of them. Yeah, Piper is definitely a good debut album. Well damn, I wasn't expecting this one to chart so high. Despite having one of my least favorite album covers from the band, and despite not expecting too much from this one going in, I was actually really pleasantly surprised by this one on my re-listen. Around the time when Roger Waters started to take overall leadership, it seems like they finally knew what they wanted to do starting with this album. To start off with, this is the first album where they composed a song over 15 minutes with the first track. It's a song that doesn't really sound like anything that they've made afterwards, where they take in a classical approach but in a rather different way, while still experimenting with some ideas here and there. And despite the song sounding different from the band's output, it does have some of the most explosive and adventurous aspects that will go on to be developed even further in future long songs from future albums. And the instrument variety here is also great. It also seems like they knew how to envelop the listener with their grandiosity from the very start too, because the song does feel grand. It's a great song. Really, my only small problem with it is that it can be a little uncohesive at times, where some parts don't really flow the best with some others, but that's about it. And the rest of the album is also really good. It has kind of a really nice, peaceful, and even reflective tone that I do love. The songs feel like a far superior version of what Roger Waters was trying to do with Grantchester Meadows, since there seems to be a far more purity in his vocals, and the lyrics here, they feel enchanting in some sense. Even the last song I do really like. It trips a bit from being experimental for the sake of it a little bit, but the instrumental bits on their own are great and shouldn't be overlooked at all because the other parts are kind of weird. Atom Heart Mother is an album that is honestly worth your time. Ah yes, The Wall. Not only known as the last album from Pink Floyd's golden age of albums, but it's pretty much one of their most popular and one of the most recognizable albums from the band as well. A conceptual album that marked pop culture as a whole, with its themes of isolating yourself from the harsh world and reaching yourself deeper into rock bottom by symbolizing it through a wall. The taller it gets, the more you distance yourself from everyone. And yeah, it's a pretty great album. Despite The Wall being an album where I always find it to be noticeably flawed from the very start, it is also one where I kind of grown to accept its flaws and even started to love the album for what it is as a whole more with time. And yeah, it is definitely flawed. You can call it self-indulgent, overdramatic and cheesy, but at the end of the day, most of the album's flaws are in a way part of its charm and why it's so memorable. And there's also a lot of great things about it as well. A thrilling story, a lot of grandiosity within its instrumentation, and pure emotion thrown in every track. Even The Trial, a song that I found myself disliking back in the day, I've grown to appreciate a lot, maybe even top 3 of the album for me. It's obviously cheesy and certainly not a song for everyone, but the cartoonish approach with the involvement of the characters we saw throughout the story of the album and the dramatic core stage that it's set in, I found myself immersed by it for the first time, even thrilled by it. Both In the Flesh songs are also unforgettable, and the first song is undeniably a particularly epic way to start the album. Then you have Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, which is the most popular song for a reason. The lyrics are simple but effective and memorable, and it has a very catchy groove to it as well, although you should never play the song without The Happiest Days of Our Lives, that's kind of necessary. And yeah, there's also Comfortably Numb, which is definitely one of the best songs that the band has ever made. It just captures that feeling of isolation just perfectly. Also, that guitar solo is just beautiful. So yeah, while a very flawed album as a whole, not only does The Good makes up for it greatly, but it's simply one of those albums where I can really get mad at its flaws. The Wall is just one of those flawed classics. For the longest time, I remember Metal being the one Pink Floyd album before the Golden Age to be particularly great. And while it's no longer the only album from their earlier output that I like, it still remains their best pre-Dark Side album for sure. Compared to Atom Heart Mother, it's a little less cohesive, but man, when this album is great, it's some of the best songs Pink Floyd has ever done. And that's the case for pretty much half the tracks actually, including the 22-minute closer Echoes, which don't worry, I'll talk about it soon. The album starts with One of These Days, which is definitely one of the highlights. It has an intense and chilling build-up with a driving riff, and it has a very satisfying drop as well. It's a pretty amazing song, like at the very least top 15 Pink Floyd. Fearless is also a highlight, mainly for that infectious acoustic rhythm. The song is a vibe, I don't know how else to describe it. And yeah, of course, there's also Echoes, a 22-minute grand song that takes half the runtime of the album. It is an absolute masterpiece, man, like, it is insane. Atom Heart Mother was already a great song that showed a lot of promise when it came to Pink Floyd making songs this long of length. But Echoes feels like the ultimate result. That also goes for some different elements that work for the song's favor. Chilling, atmospheric, peaceful yet overwhelming. It's one of their most transcendent and adventurous songs, one of their best songs, and even a downright haunting one. Even the ambient sections, while a little bit hard to digest at first, I've grown to love as well. Metal is just a stepping stone for the band, not entirely consistently amazing as there are some songs that are noticeably better than others, even if the weaker tracks aren't necessarily bad, but it's the first album in their discography that reaches some insane heights that the following 3 albums will consistently do. Speaking of the following 3, Well, Dark Side of the Moon. Arguably the most popular album from the band, the album that set Pink Floyd to mainstream popularity and attention, the album that you probably saw on someone's t-shirt. Yeah, it's a really great album. This is actually also the album where the band started to build their albums based on several themes that will connect the songs together. Dark Side mainly explores the theme of madness, but also some others like time, greed, death, and mental illness. It is definitely one of those albums that needs to be listened properly from start to finish. I mean, you could say the same thing for pretty much any album out there, but Dark Side is especially one of those cases, considering some of the interludes that connect the songs together, as well as the adventurous tone of it all. And yeah, as far as cohesive experiences go, Dark Side is the band's most refined and cohesive record yet by that point. The album has a lot of their most essential songs. Time is an absolute classic. The song opens with a bunch of clocks ringing, then slowly leading to some opening riffs, till the drop, which is unforgettable, and the guitar solo in the middle and how it bounces off the more floaty sound is perfect. Lyrics are also great. You also have Great Kick in the Sky, which is insane. The most chilling song, but also the most floaty one. Claire Story's one-take vocal performance here is truly something else. Then you have Money, which was pretty much the most commercially successful song on the album, a groove-centered song that pretty much accomplishes everything that it's set to do. The last two tracks end the album in a pretty satisfying way and are also great. On the Run, despite being sort of an interlude, always engaged me with its accelerating sound that goes perfectly in between Breathe and Time. And then you have Us and Them, which is in my opinion the best song on the album and definitely a top 5 Pink Floyd song in general. It's an absolutely magical song with how dreamy and layered it is throughout, especially with the drop in the chorus, which is just truly ascending. And the saxophone, man, you cannot forget the saxophone. So yeah, Dark Side is undeniably a classic. And now approaching to the top 2. This and the number 1 spot are albums that I think are very close together and represent Pink Floyd at their most, well, perfect back to back. Starting off, we have Animals. Animals is kind of a perfect album when it comes to the themes, the emotion, song structure, and in general how much the band packs in and goes all out throughout start to finish. It is certainly one of the most meaty and satisfying records that the band has ever done, as well as one of the angriest ones as well actually. To start off, I do really like both picks on the Wing tracks that serve as kind of the opening and closing interludes to the album. They're simple, but they're actually very pretty and charming segments that serve their purpose in both setting the album up and closing it off. And then Ducks. Ducks is brutally insane. An accelerating and epic 17-minute long song that talks about class and the purpose that people serve in the world, classifying people as the dogs, which fits. There's so much to unpack from Ducks. These slow, explosive, climatic parts on the middle are awesome, and everything the song builds before and in between those groovy riffs are instantly thrilling. They always lead well into those satisfying payoffs as well. Pix is excellent too. Love the main synth line, love the aggressive and menacing emotion in the track. And just like Ducks, it's a song where the band truly goes all out in its progressive approach, although this time with a dirtier and darker tone. I will even say more rhythmic based. And Chip is really great too. Kinda has elements of both songs, are on the same level of excellent songwriting and energy, but also brings in some atmospheric elements that do truly feel haunting. I also do really like the theme they approach of mindless people bandwagoning without having their own opinion or questioning themselves what they're mindlessly following. Animals just keeps you thrilled all the way through. It has some of the most interesting and fun themes of any Pink Floyd album, some of the best musical moments, some of the best ideas, and there's really nothing that I particularly dislike about it. It's really fantastic and very close to making it to my number 1 spot, but there was one album that did surpass it. And now finally, Wish You Were Here. In my opinion, the band's magnum opus, their absolute pick. This was the follow-up to Dark Side of the Moon, and while at the time having somewhat of a mixed reception due to how different it was compared to Dark Side, it has grown to subsequent critical acclaim and a favorite for many people. Let's go track by track for this one. Shine On You Crazy Diamonds Parts 1 and 5 is the album's opener, and it's probably the best opening song that the band has ever done. Sets the tone and sound of the album perfectly, with slow, spacey and open atmospheres and build-ups. A lot of great guitar solos in here, and the payoff in the chorus, which is always rewarding, no matter what. It's one of the band's best songs, it really does feel like a journey. Welcome to the Machine is also an amazing song. This was a song that I actually thought it was great, but the weakest of the record back in the day, but it has grown on me and re-listened, while keeping the spacey atmosphere on Shine On You Crazy Diamond, and it succeeds at it greatly. Then Have a Cigar, which I kind of see it as the spiritual successor to Money, with its dramatic sequences, but also the scenes throughout the track that I can't get enough of. It's the most cynical of all the tracks, a song about mocking the music industry, packed with a very bitter vocal performance from Roger Waters. Also continues to pack in some amazing guitar solos from Gilmour that we've seen in previous songs. Shine On You Crazy Diamond Part 6 to 9, the closing track, is also amazing. The build up for the song goes for a more frantic and accelerating build up, but also has a fantastic concluding progressive section at the end. And it has some of the same elements that we've seen from parts 1 to 5. You have the build up, then the payoff from the chorus. The difference here is that the climatic part of parts 6 to 9 revolves more on what it does after the chorus. And leaving the best for last, you have the title track, Wish You Were Here. This is one of my favorite songs of all time. Although a simple ballad in surface, it's one of the most haunting and heartbreaking songs that the band has ever done easily, with a very touching and moving performance all around. It's a song that always reaches deep in my soul every time I listen to it. It's just beautiful. And side note, I do like how they kept some of that eerie atmosphere on earlier songs to this song as well. Really does add up to the haunting and isolated approach that the song goes for. Wish You Were Here is just an incredible album. Every song is unforgettable, and it just comes together perfectly. And that was my ranking of the Pink Floyd albums.